So this week in the Sacred Gathering, we will be getting together the day after what is called on the traditional calendar Holy Cross Saturday. This is a reminder, kind of in the midst of the normal part of the church year, of just how important the means which God chose to use to bring about the healing of both us as people and the entire world is, and what it cost him. And so the cross itself is something that I think we get our heads around most of the time. We understand kind of the sacrificial imagery or the redeeming buying metaphors, those sorts of things. The Bible talks about what the cross is and its significance in a lot of different ways. But I just think in their wisdom, those who set up this kind of calendar reminded us that in the midst of busyness, sometimes we need to be reminded of what is actually important, what it is actually that we believe, what is kind of the center and the core of Christianity, this thing which we have dedicated our lives to. And so the passage we're going to look at comes out of 1 Corinthians chapter 1. It is probably one of the key passages in all of Paul's theology, explaining what he thinks is most important, what the significance is of following Christ. And the way he starts it out is like, so the word of the cross, talking about the word of the cross. This is another way of talking about the gospel. And I ran into this week kind of a reminder of what the stakes are in one of the commentaries I was reading, in which the very famous author N.T. Wright puts kind of the stakes this way. The Christian good news is all about God dying on a rubbish heap at the wrong end of empire. It's all about God babbling nonsense to a room full of philosophers. It's all about the true God confronting the world of posturing and power and prestige and overthrowing it in order to set up his own kingdom. A kingdom in which the weak and the foolish find themselves just as welcome as the strong and the wise, if not more so. Think back to Jesus himself, to the people he befriended, and ask yourself whether Paul is not being utterly loyal to his master. And that's kind of the reminder of the gospel that we're talking about. I love this phrase of God dying in the rubbish heap at the wrong end of empire. And we're going to see in this passage again and again, Paul recognizes the implications of God turning the world and all its values on its head by this horrific action of the cross. And so one of the kind of interesting context pieces about the passage I'm about to read, it is to the Corinthian church. This is a church that the gospel writer Paul has a very stormy relationship with her. He was kind of like the theologian in residence. He helped get this series of churches in the town of Corinth started, and yet he kind of fought with them a lot. And so most of the time in Paul's writing, he prefers to talk about the resurrection, right? That God can bring life and victory from anything. But for this church, and I think because of the context of who they were as a town, he needs to talk about the cross and the significance of the kind of absurd way in which God has chosen to bring about the healing of the world. So you probably know a lot of this. You've probably heard this from, Bible studies and much better sermons than you're ever going to get at Wayfarers. But Corinth itself, the town itself, had been a couple hundred years before this was written, had been completely leveled. It had led a rebellion against Rome. So it wasn't there anymore. And yet Rome recognized that the town was in a really good spot. It sits kind of that big isthmus that is part of the Greek Isles, and so you could use it if you kind of created a land route. If you created these ports, you could use it to avoid going all the way around I think Peloponnesus, it's called, that giant landmass, which is very dangerous for ships and things. So Corinth, it was only a matter of time till it's going to be rebuilt because it's got such a great location. So it's at this point that Paul is writing, it is the third largest city in the entire Roman Empire. I mean, it's got a reputation like Chicago, right? This is a major urban center. It's only about 100 years old, so it's new. It doesn't have a lot of the problems. It's modern. It's a place of dreams. It's a place where people go to make something of themselves. It has a huge military presence because The military would often give people land at the end of their career when they retired. So it's got a little bit like Colorado Springs, a little feel of a military town. But again, this is a big town. It's got to feel like a New York. It's got to feel like an LA, right? It's a city of dreams. It's an up and coming place. It's a place where people go to become somebody. And I think because of that, this mentality of everyone's there for a dream, everybody there is trying to one up one another, it gets expressed in these churches that are taking place there, right? And these churches are just tearing themselves apart, specifically over lack of unity. And I think a lot of that mentality is there of what they've gotten from this urban city in which everyone's there for a reason, in which everyone's sizing each other up. It's a town of winners and losers, right? This does not make for a very unified uh, church body, especially one that is as egalitarian as the church is supposed to be, right? We got winners and losers together, except there aren't supposed to be those. And so Paul, they're fighting about authority, they're fighting over what's moral, what's not, they're fighting over what's the correct relationship with the culture around. It sounds an awful lot like the American church, right? And into this setting, into this argument, is what we get this famous passage in which Paul, like Jesus before him, is trying to turn everything and its values on its head. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 at verse 18 we read, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where's the one who's wise? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." So one of the big things he's kind of working with here is not pointing out what is obvious and it looks like at the moment, but it's kind of the end goal of things, right? I love this phrase, to those who are perishing, or another translation I saw was those who are on their way to ruin. So, on your way to something, on your way to what's the destination, where are we headed? Those who are perishing, it's also a great image, because often people who are actively dying don't know it until they're much closer to the end. Those who are on their way to ruin, to scandal, to things completely falling apart. It feels an awful lot like those who are being saved. Note that both of these are kind of a process. What are we heading towards? Who are we becoming? What is waiting for us at the end? And that's kind of one of the things that he's going to point on. It can be difficult to see when we're in the midst of it where this is actually all heading. And that is one of the major points here that he's going to challenge again and again. The things that the philosophers are saying, the people looking for proof and signs, it makes sense at the moment. When you're in the midst of things, you don't have the perspective to see this is actually heading toward ruin. This is actually a form of perishing. This is a form of death. And the goal is, of course, not something that's in our past. For Christians, right? It's a journey. We are in the process of being saved. We're being saved. And I think that that's a really important piece of this, of living it out and showing who we actually are, is something that is not obvious, not even to ourselves at times. And yet at the same time, there's this very important phrase, right? But to those of us who are being saved, it's the power of God. And I think this is important because things like the cross, things like Jesus' Beatitudes, in which he's just kind of describing God's kingdom and the cross in other ways, they are very easy for people to say, oh yeah, that sounds really pretty. Oh yeah, that sounds really important. But I live in the real world here. I gotta be utilitarian. I gotta make do with what I got. And that sounds really nice, but here in the real world, um, things aren't that easy. They aren't that clean cut. And that's true in some ways, but that's also the logic of those who are perishing. That's the logic of those who are on their way to ruin, right? I can't follow those things. I can't do it. It's just too much of an ideal. And again, he describes here as this is the very power of God. This is something that actually works. And when we get to what it is Jesus actually means by the cross, we're almost always going to start throwing up, defensive barriers. Like, well, he couldn't have actually meant that. Oh, well, that's not really true. Again, here in the real world, or it just doesn't work the way, it's not the way the world works. Of course, it isn't in some ways. And yet, I think most of us who are having this conversation have experienced the power of God. We have seen change in our hearts and our lives. We have seen change in the world at large. We have seen God actually do real things. It's not just some abstract idea. It's not just some ideal that, oh, wouldn't it be nice if the world was in such a way that the least actually were taken care of. And that's how most of us, even those of us that say we are following God, tend to approach these things. Do we truly recognize Christ's power? Do we recognize that this actually works here in the real world, though the results may not always be as apparent and as obvious as we would prefer? Are we going to trust God's timing on that? And so, as we're going through this, I want us to take just a moment of reflection. Like, okay, where have we actually seen God do things? How have we actually been changed? Where have we seen God actually at work? Because I think we need to use those sorts of moments as an anchor as we continue in thinking through some of the implications of what the cross actually is, right? And so that knowledge that God is actually doing things in the world is going to contrast really sharply with probably a lot of the ways we prefer to. In verse 22, he says, look, the Jews demand signs. Okay, you claim that God's power shows up as folly. You claim that, again, that God shows his greatness by being in the rubbish heap at the end of human history. Okay, great. Prove it. Right? Show me that this is where God is. Give me a sign. This is the exact same thing they gave of Jesus. They said, okay, do a magic trick. Prove it. We'll follow. We'll listen to you. And again and again and again, Jesus did things and showed things and healed people, right? And yet people wanted nothing to do with it because he could heal all day long. He could feed the 5,000. But when he said, this thing does not end in victory, this thing does not end in you being comfortable or being considered an influencer or whatever the language would have been back then, right? This thing ends in a cross. They say, well, I think there was plenty of proof that Jesus was on to something, right? And miracles and stuff. And the same thing is said to Paul, right? Religious people are saying, okay, if you think this is God's, prove it. I'm happier, I'm wealthier, therefore I must be right. Might makes right. My people are in office right now. Maybe God does prefer me, that sort of thing, right? Or maybe we'll go with the Greeks, the philosophers, right? We want a system of thinking. We want this to be logical. Great, explain it to me. If you show me the steps and get me there, if you have a compelling argument, okay, then maybe I'll hear you out. Like, people who are very passionate and invested in things can come up with some pretty compelling arguments. There's some smart people out there. There are those times when someone who disagrees with us can just dance circles around us in their arguments and the things they're saying, and we can read articles online or whatever and just be like, yeah, that does kind of make sense. It all seems to make sense. And that's what people are looking for. They're looking for this compelling argument, the person who can argue the best, or who, they talk about in here, the debater, the person who can prove what their point is. Because again, we don't want to go to the cross. It's ridiculous. It's foolish. The cross represents like the ultimate losing, right? Come and take everything you value and let it die. Let all the goodness and the love that Jesus proved come crashing up against just raw political power, raw violence. Who do we think's going to win? Well, if we look at the story, it can be pretty easy to interpret it as Rome won, Empire won, violence wins. The bad guys do win in the end because they're just willing to be more realistic, right? Unless, of course, we have experienced the power of God through things like the cross. If we've realistically looked at ourselves, seen a deep need, and seen that God actually can use things that seem absurd. God can actually use broken things. God can actually bring healing and wholeness through the very darkness that the world tends to be a lot better at creating, right? And unless we can trust that this is the way that God works, we are always going to default to the playbook of the world. We will go with what it's not what I wanted to be, but it's what works. It's the way the world actually is, right? Well, I'm willing to go with you if you just show me a little bit of proof. If you just, whether it's big dramatic proof, logical proof, whatever. We do not want to go to the place of the cross where things don't make sense, where pain and misery and the absurd show up. And yet that is the place I think God has to take most of us before we are willing to trust him. If we can use any other tool, most of the time we will. And yet that is where God's power shows up so much of the time. I really like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's quote about cheap grace, in which he describes the way we want to approach the cross most of the time is, okay, yeah, Jesus died on the cross, that's great. And now my sin is away, right? It's we like the washing metaphors. It's like washing my hands. Great, I got this grime off my hands, now I got nice and clean hands. And he says that's a cheap grace. You don't understand what the cross actually means and what your job is in entering the cross with it. He says, look, it's not about washing your hands, about getting off free. It's actually about the sinner that you were, dying that you may be resurrected. It's not about washing your hands clean. It's about getting a completely new set of hands. And that frightens us. We feel like God is going to take it to too far of things. There may be things we like or seem unnecessary, pain, or entering into places of confusion and suffering with others or our own that don't feel necessary. God, is this really the only way to do it? And I think if we truly are going to take Jesus' journey to the cross seriously, I wonder if there's any possible way to use that to inflate our personal or political power in the world. That's been done plenty in the name of Christ, right? I wonder if there's any way in which at the end of the day we get to show off how clever we are, how good our arguments are. If we get to come out on top in the end, right? Do we get to leave the situation of the cross with some kind of a bonus? Even though that's how we tend to approach it so much of the time. I think the cross, if we really understood it, aside from God, destroys results. We would much rather do things and behave in a way that gets the results we want, or at least good enough results. The cross is not about that. And aside from God's goodness and ability to use it, it is simply death. It is simply suffering. It is simply the meaninglessness that is lurking behind so much of our activity, trying desperately not to look at the world or ourselves as we actually are. And yet God's power is shown in the cross. It rips to shreds this utilitarian view. It rips to shreds the idea that maybe we can come out in the end in the way we're hoping to. We die, just like God did, that we can be resurrected. We die and become completely new things by the cross. And so, yeah, that's offensive to just basically everybody. We still don't really want to do it. We still don't really want to have to trust God to that length. And yet God is inviting us to be completely new people, to have a completely new life than before, to set aside the other way of doing things, to trust his kinds of values, to spend time with his kinds of people, not based on results, not based on power, not based on prestige, not based on any of the stuff we want and we are hoping we're going to get in the end, but to truly trust the way that God works, and to be invited into another kingdom, and to be invited into an actual good, full life lived in defiance of all the fake versions that are out there. And so it can be hard to read passages like this, the foolishness of actually going to those places, of walking towards pain, of walking towards our own humiliation, not because God hates us, but because he loves us. He loves us so much, he was willing to go through this. The one person who could keep his hands clean of all this, so that Jesus could go through the cross, so that we could go through the cross and be healed. We could go through the cross and become completely new people and point to a completely new way of being in the world, point to a God who is powerful, and his power is not shown in all the ways we want it to be, but in his ability to overcome death and absurdity and the cross itself. So, random day through in the fall, we're confronted again with that which we're trying to avoid, and the fact that God is good and loving and powerful in the midst of the absurdity that is the cross.